And this one is about Chris Hedges and Bernie Sanders. So Chris Hedges had a speaking engagement, and he had some things to say about Bernie Sanders and how Bernie Sanders really failed us, the American people, the people who canvassed for him, the people who donated money to him, the people who voted for him, the people who believed in his movement. Chris Hedges had some things to say.
In a sense, you know, Thomas Franks wrote a book, What's the Matter with Kansas, and posited the question, how can people vote against their own interests? I mean, it's a good book, but he's wrong. They're not voting against their own interests. The Democratic Party long ago stopped protecting the interests of working men and women and has been selling them out. And that is becoming incredibly apparent. And my frustration with Sanders is that he has decided to give legitimacy to a party that has been completely complicit.
I just want to jump in here for just a second. What Chris Hedges said about voting against your own interests, I've been guilty of using that phrase a lot. I use it a lot on here. I tell people, I'm like, well, people vote against their own interests. And he mentioned something there that I didn't think about before. When it comes to the Democratic Party, I can't speak for Republicans. I've never been Republican. I don't know. But when it comes to the Democratic Party, they're actually not voting against their own interests because the Democratic Party turned against the working class people years ago. If I'm not mistaken, I think Chris Hedges said the last time we had elections in this country where they weren't bought per se, I think it goes all the way back to like the 50s. I have to double check that, but it's been a long time. But now he goes into the problem with Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders' relationship with the Democratic Party. So let's hear more about that.
And my frustration with Sanders is that he has decided to give legitimacy to a party that has been completely complicit in this destruction. And you saw it with the debate. He refused to call Clinton out. Clinton, who, you know, even in the silly thing like the emails. Yep. I mean, Clinton is defending wholesale surveillance of the American public, but feels she has a right to privacy. And unfortunately, this has been a long, kind of dirty arrangement with Sanders and the Democratic Party. He campaigned for Clinton in '92. He campaigned again for Clinton in '96. This was after NAFTA, after the omnibus crime bill, after the destruction of welfare. He knew.
Okay, and I have to jump in here. I did not realize that Bernie Sanders also campaigned for Bill Clinton. So I want people to know which Clinton he's talking about right now, because I watched this video twice and I was like, well, wait a minute. He's talking about Bill Clinton, 1992. So I did not know that. I was not aware of that. So that was kind of eye-opening to me to see that this goes way back with Bernie. Bernie been in bed with the Democratic Party. Like, for Bill Clinton, really? He was not left at all, really. But that was eye-opening to me. So I do just want you guys to know that he's talking about Bill Clinton right now. And he even mentioned, even after the crime bill, Bernie Sanders still campaigned for Bill Clinton. So I have to go back and find some video on that. But yeah, that was a wake-up call for me.
I've worked with Ralph and on his campaigns, and in 2004 he was calling on Ralph to step down, not to run, and everyone should support Kerry. He has seniority in the Democratic caucus. He has been the major impediment to a third party in Vermont, and the quid pro quo is that the Democrats will not run a serious candidate against him. And so my fear is that, I think he's raised $23 million, that all of this money, all of this passion gets funneled back into that black hole of Democratic politics. The system is completely gamed.
Let's talk about that for just a second. I donated a lot of money to Bernie Sanders for 2020, that's for sure. And I did find it somewhat strange that all of a sudden last year and going into this year, I am getting email messages from people that I have never donated to, people I have never voted for, people who are Democrat politicians that I never supported. Why am I getting emails from Nancy Pelosi? Why am I getting text messages from Nancy Pelosi? It was very strange to me. And the first thing I thought was, how in the world did her team get my email address? Because I've never supported them before. And so the only reasoning for this that I could come up with is that somewhere along the way, I believe that Bernie Sanders must have given his email list to the Democratic Party, to the DNC, because I don't understand how else they could have contacted me if I was not on their list before. So that's another example of how he just kind of funnels you back into the Democratic Party. And this is just, my belief, my opinion. We can talk more about it tonight on Call In, but this is one of the things that I've noticed myself. He continues to bring you back into the Democratic Party. Ran twice in a row, lost twice in a row, still told you to do what? To vote for the corporate Democrat candidate. So all that money that Bernie Sanders brought in, where did all that money go? Like, after he suspended his campaign, where did all the money go? I wouldn't be surprised if it went into the DNC. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that if Bernie Sanders was really serious about a revolution, was really serious about a real political movement sweeping this country, or progressive movement sweeping this country, then Bernie Sanders would have never ran as a Democrat the second time around. In 2020, he would have ran as an independent, or he would have ran third party to really shake things up. Bernie Sanders wasn't 100% committed to a revolution. That's the problem. And I think he knew that the Democratic Party was only going to let him go so far, which is interesting because he's not a Democrat, but he caucuses with the Democrats. So they see him as one of them. And I think Bernie Sanders knew that. After 2016, going into 2020, I think Bernie Sanders knew that there were certain limitations that the DNC was going to put on him. So let's go back into the video.
Genuine candidate we had in the United States in the Democratic Party was George McGovern, the last real insurgent candidate. And not only did the Democratic establishment destroy him, but they rewrote the rules so that it would never happen again. And since then, these have been coronations. And the Clinton machine is going to make sure there's another coronation, which means that I expect to see Sanders out there campaigning on behalf of Hillary Clinton.
And that happened. And
the reverberations of that are going to be seismic, because it's just one more snuffing out of hope through legitimate change. All of my energy now goes into the building of movements. I was just with these anti-fracking activists in Denver from around the country. Before that, I was with members of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement, which I support, and who are trying to take Israel down school by school, church by church, pension fund by pension fund. The struggle to raise the minimum wage, Black Lives Matter, which is a very important movement in the United States, and I know there's a movement of similar against carding here in Toronto. One of the things about all of these movements, they're youth-driven, and they totally get it. So when the established black leadership, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, came to Ferguson and Baltimore, they were booed out of the city. These people, they totally understand, but they also understand that the system is utterly gamed against them. And, we have to, I write in...
Hold on one second. Let's hear that part one more time. I think that's important for people to listen to.
Which is a very important movement in the United States, and I know there's a movement of similar against carding here in Toronto. One of the things about all of these movements, they're youth-driven, and they totally get it. So when the established black leadership, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, came to Ferguson and Baltimore, they were booed out of the city. These people, they totally understand, but they also understand that the system is utterly gamed against them.
So there's something I want to add here when he said that these movements are youth driven. Let's focus on that for just a second.
Movement in the United States, and I know there's a movement of similar against carding here in Toronto. One of the things about all of these movements, they're youth driven, and they.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. When you think about Bernie Sanders' movement, if you remove people from the ages of 25, let's go further out here to 40. If you remove the college kids, if you remove people who are not in college, who are still ages 18 to 25, does Bernie Sanders still have a movement? Who really drove Bernie Sanders campaigns, 2016 and 2020? Who really drove the movement? It was young people. It was young people. Even when you looked at the polls in reference to voting, Bernie had the younger vote. That was the same thing for Hillary Clinton, and that was the same thing for when he ran against Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders had the young vote. So if you take away the youth, these were the people that really were like, let's rise up, let's fight back. Now let's go back to the civil rights movement. What was the difference? Yes, there were young people out there fighting, but with the civil rights movement, you had older people too. Big difference. One was connected to a campaign, to an election, and the other one was not. One was relying on direct action and mutual aid, and the other one was not. It was connected to a campaign. One of those movements actually worked, and the other one did not. I like to draw the differences between those two movements per se. And some people will argue maybe Bernie Sanders really didn't have a movement. It was just two campaigns, whatever you want to call it. But if you take the youth away, does Bernie Sanders have a movement? No. So sometimes I look back on it and I feel like Bernie Sanders really preyed on, or maybe not preyed on, but he heavily played the younger people. He played on the youth because he knew a lot of times younger people, we're more likely to believe. We're more likely to have some type of hope and want to fight and change the future. Now, you talk to people like my parents, grandparents, they done already been through this game. They know how it works. They know that my dad told me this. My dad said, look, the game is rigged. He tried to tell me that back when I was very passionate about voting for Barack Obama. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to listen. I was like, oh, Dad, what do you know? Turns out Dad knew a lot. So I think this is incredibly important that people really understand that Bernie Sanders, in a sense, played on the young population in this country to believe in some type of revolutionary change that would be done through the electoral system, which deep down at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders knew that would not happen. And he knew that because he had already been a politician for multiple years and he knew how the system worked. Got a lot of our money, though. Let's go back into the video.
Totally get it. So when the established black leadership, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, came to Ferguson and Baltimore, they were booed out of the city. These people, they totally understand. But they also understand that the system is utterly gamed against them. And, we have to, I write in Wages of Rebellion that perhaps the most daunting existential struggle of our times is to accept the reality of what's before us because it's bleak, and yet resist anyway. I mean, anyone who reads climate change reports, every new one I read is even more dire than the last. If we stopped all carbon emissions today, we would still have catastrophic effects of climate change. And the latest reports are saying, everybody had assumed that there would be a linear progression to climate change, i.e., every year would get a little hotter, and they said that's probably wrong, that it will be a non-linear breakdown, so that entire systems will begin, ecological systems, Gulf streams and everything will begin to fall apart, which, by the way, mirrors how societies break down. So you have the facade of the superstructure, and that facade appears solid, but internally the structure itself is decaying and rotting, so that when it comes down in a kind of dizzying spiral. And that was true in all the revolutions I covered in Eastern Europe and everywhere else. Alexander Berkman actually wrote a really good essay about it called The Invisible Revolution, where he said that when a revolution takes place, you never see it.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that. One thing I do want people to understand, when a real revolution happens in this country, it's not going to be televised. It's not going to be all over the media. Like the real revolution that happens, mainstream media isn't going to want you to see it. Mainstream media isn't going to want to show that narrative. They're not going to want to show the people are really rising up and taking over. They're not going to want to show you that. They want you to see, especially people abroad. They want people abroad to know the United States government and the police state here has people under control. The real revolution will not be televised. So I'm glad that he said that.
It's all about people losing faith in the ruling ideology, whether, it's the reign of the monarchs or communism or whatever. And that people only see it when the structure itself, but that process is, he likens it to boiling water in a kettle. And I think that's right from my own experience. When things collapse, and what it is that triggers the collapse, it's all kind of mysterious. I think a lot of the great writers on revolution, Bakunin, even Lenin and others have noted this. Lenin, 6 weeks before the Russian Revolution, got up and gave a speech in Switzerland and said, well, those of us who are old will never see revolution in our, next thing you know, he's being ferried courtesy of the Kaiser on a German train to St. Petersburg. So you can't tell what's coming. It's always the ruling class that determines the configuration of revolt. But the longer the ruling elites remain obtuse, the longer the ruling elites not only refuse to respond, but actually extract more and more blood and marrow from the society in the name of austerity, the more they make inevitable blowback. That blowback could be a very frightening proto-fascist right-wing blowback.
Let's listen to this part one more time, and then I'll go back to the part where he said it could be a right-wing blowback. But what he says here about the elites, I want us to pay close attention to.
Or whatever. And that people only see it when the structure itself, but that process is, he likens it to boiling water in a kettle. And I think that's right from my own experience. When things collapse, and what it is that triggers the collapse, it's all kind of mysterious. I think a lot of the great writers on revolution, Bakunin, even Lenin and others have noted this. Lenin, 6 weeks before the Russian Revolution, got up and gave a speech in Switzerland and said, well, those of us who are old will never see revolution in our, next thing you know, he's being ferried courtesy of the Kaiser on a German train to St. Petersburg. So you can't tell what's coming. It's always the ruling class that determines the configuration of
that part right there. It's always the ruling class that determine the configuration. And this is true. People wonder why I focus so much on, we need to pay attention to the wealthy. We need to pay attention to the billionaires. Why I focus so much on the class system, because they're the ones that call the shots and make the decisions. Now, let's just talk about what just happened a couple of days ago, right? We just talked about the Bilderberg meeting in DC. Bilderberg 2022? Most people I've talked to didn't even know that was happening. Even after I reported on it, most people were like, what? What is that? And you had all of these powerful people in one room. The meeting was so important to the point that they blocked off the entire hotel. So no one could reserve a room and no one could even enter the hotel. Max Blumenthal tried to enter. Franco tried to enter as well. Neither of them were allowed in. Security was like, no, you can't come in unless you have this lanyard, right? Why is that? The list of people that were in that meeting, the King of Netherlands, CIA. Why do you have Pfizer there? Why do you have the CEO of Shell? Why was Kirsten Sinema there when, yes, she's a politician, she's in Congress, but she doesn't even have a leadership position? Why was she there? You have Stacey Abrams on the board. You had people like Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, all these billionaires meeting with government officials, and they didn't want us to know about it. Mainstream media didn't even talk about it. This is why I tell you, those are the people you have to pay attention to. What are they doing? People like Joe Biden, they're just puppets. They're just puppets. Eric, do you still have that image that you can put up, the one that breaks down the class system? You know which one I'm talking about. I've showed it on here before. I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show you that graphic. I know there's new people that have, joined, and I'll go back to the end of the Chris Hedges video, but I know there's newer people watching. So I do want to say, I want to show that again one more time, because I really want to show you that these politicians, they're not as powerful as we think they are. Yes, they can do things like executive order. Yes, Joe Biden can do that, but there's a reason why he's not. So let me go ahead and share that here. Let's take a look at this. Some of you may have seen this before. Some of you may have not. We need to look at feudalism then and now. And so when we look at medieval feudalism, by rank at the top, there were the monarchs. This includes your kings, your queens, and your emperors. Next was landed gentry, dukes, earls, barons. After them, clergy, archbishops, priests. Next, royal ministers, chancellors, constables, sheriffs. After that, merchants, traders, explorers, East India Co. Next, vassals, tenant farmers, military officers. And at the bottom, everyone else, peasants, laborers, conscripts. Now let's look at corporate feudism. Let's go into today. At the very top, you have the central bankers. This includes the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, ECB. Next, the big bankers, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Lloyd's. Next, the corporate elite, Fortune 500 and multinationals. After corporate elite, elected officials, presidents, MPs, representatives. After elected officials, top bureaucrats, commissioners, secretaries, judges. After bureaucrats, top professionals, doctors, entertainers, clergy. And right here at the bottom, everyone else, workers, students, soldiers. Most of us sit right here where it says everyone else. Now, let's go up here where it says elected officials. If you will notice, presidents, they're in the middle. They're not at the top. They're not at the bottom. They're in the middle. And the corporate elite and the big bankers and the central bankers are above your elected officials. which means who is really in charge? It's not Joe Biden. It's not Kamala Harris. It's the banks. It's the corporations. All of these are above your elected officials. I think that's really important for people to see, and it's really important for people to know. Now, let's go back to that video. So we'll go back into that, and we'll let him finish what he's saying here.
Revolt, but the longer the ruling elites remain obtuse, the longer the ruling elites not only refuse to respond, but actually extract more and more blood and marrow from the society in the name of austerity, the more they make inevitable blowback. That blowback could be a very frightening proto-fascist right-wing blowback. But blowback there will be. I mean, you know, in the breakdown of capitalism, many countries in Europe went one way and the United States went another.
Right. So this is something too that I will say that I've actually brought up before. Kim Iverson has also brought this up before on Rising. I think the next time you see some type of a movement, like a big movement like that happen in the United States, like what Bernie was trying to do, I don't think you're going to see it on the left. I think it's going to happen on the right. And honestly, they might actually succeed. Because whether you like them or not, they tend to stick together. And when it comes to people on the left, we don't. We're just a mess. It's all over the place, right? The next time you see a movement like that really emerge in this country, one that will be successful where Bernie's movement was not in the end, I think it's going to happen on the right.